Hello and welcome to the Year 10 lesson on propaganda and culture in Nazi Germany. Now, this is part of a wider series of lessons thinking about how did the Nazis stay in power between 1933 and 1945. Last lesson, you would have looked at terror in Nazi Germany and looked at things like the concentration camps and the secret police, the Gestapo. Now, if for any reason you didn't do that lesson, maybe you were ill, it's really important that you go back and you complete that work. There is a link to it by going through Show My Homework, or you could even use this playlist that this video is part of, and it's on there as well. But today's lesson is about how effectively was propaganda used as a means to control the German population, and this is the title that you need. Now, if you have a printer, what you can do is print the sheets that are on Show My Homework and you can do the notes on there. If you don't have a printer, don't worry, you're not disadvantaged. You can just do the notes on lined paper and then keep it safe either in your black folder or somewhere else if your black folder is at school. Let's make a start on the lesson. Remember, the idea is that you can pause it to complete the task, and it's really important that you finish this video by the end of today. Try and make sure you get it done in the lesson if you can, but if you can't get it all done, then please complete it for your homework. So we're going to be using the term propaganda a lot in today's lesson, and I want to just make sure that everybody knows what we mean by propaganda. So we've got two different definitions of propaganda here. Either of them are absolutely fine to use, but essentially it's the use of the media, things like newspapers, radio, even things like films, to try and aggressively promote a point of view. In this case of the Nazis, people like Goebbels wanted to try and make sure that people supported them, so they made sure that all of the different forms of media convinced people to support Nazis. He also used censorship, which is basically when you stop people from hearing certain information. In the case of Nazi Germany, they censored any bad news. So newspapers, for instance, weren't allowed to say negative things about the Nazis or the state of the country. Everything had to be positive unless it was about their opponents. So that's what we mean by propaganda and censorship. So we've just mentioned a key individual that we need to know about, Joseph Goebbels. Now, he was the Minister for Propaganda. I'd like you to make some notes. Definitely the bits in red at the very least, and you can do this either on the sheet if you printed it or under a subheading of Goebbels if you haven't got a printer. So Goebbels was somebody that joined the Nazis in the 1920s. He was there right from the beginning, essentially. He was even involved in things like the Munich Putsch. He wanted to try and help ensure that there was limited opposition to the Nazis because he passionately believed that Hitler was the saviour of Germany, and he wanted to convince other people of that message too. He used every resource available to him to try and make people loyal to Hitler and the Nazis. Every form of media he wanted to control. And he spearheads the production of propaganda films. He personally watched every single film before it was released in Germany. And he was also responsible for the mass book burnings that we'll talk more about later. So pause the video here and make some notes about Goebbels. You definitely want the bits in red, but it's up to you if you add the other bits too. We're now going to watch a little documentary clip which is going to introduce you to propaganda in a little bit more depth. It's going to talk to you about the different forms of propaganda and the kind of messages that the Nazis used, and also how much they repeated those messages. Now, as we watch it, I'd like you to try and make some bullet pointed notes about propaganda. This is just giving you an idea of the things we're going to look at in greater depth during the lesson. So I'm going to press play now, and I want you to watch this video and make some bullet pointed notes about propaganda.
Hi, I'm Michael Moynihan for Reason TV, and today we are at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum with Steve Lookert, the curator of State of Deception, the Power of Nazi Propaganda.
We wanted to examine the role of Nazi propaganda, how they used it to facilitate persecution, mass murder.
Hi, I'm Michael Moynihan for Reason TV, and today we are at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum with Steve Lookert, the curator of State of Deception, the Power of Nazi Propaganda.
We wanted to examine the role of Nazi propaganda, how they used it to facilitate persecution, mass murder, and war. When you think about how quick that Nazi rise to power was. That for most of the period of the Weimar Republic, the Nazi Party was largely a joke.
Ich habe mir ein Ziel gesteckt, nämlich die 30 Parteien aus Deutschland hinauszufegen.
1928, the Nazi Party only had 12 seats in the German parliament out of almost 600. But 1930 gets 107 seats. Then 1932, it more than doubles that. They learned how to simplify a message, how to play upon voters' emotions, how to reduce very complicated issues to slogans. This is a Braille copy of Mein Kampf.
A Braille copy of Mein Kampf, contemporaneously. Were people reading this?
Yeah, particularly those that were the propagandists. This was kind of the Bible for them, that they would draw on what was said in there. And of course, excerpts from Mein Kampf were used everywhere to justify various policies. But this became a bestseller, and Hitler made a fortune off the royalties from this. And it was published in, I think, 16, 17 different languages. These posters inform us a great deal about Nazi thinking and the ways in which they presented images to the public, whether it's of this kind of strong, heroic figure breaking the chains of slavery, this playing upon dissatisfaction with the status quo, the ways in which they engaged in what today we would call niche marketing. So it's women who work in the home, farmers, workers. You don't tend to associate the Nazis with the word freedom, but they used it endlessly.
What was the sort of methodology behind choosing these bright red colors?
Hitler talked about how in the early 20s he would create posters for his meetings in red because he understood the way it could provoke people, that it was a way to engage an audience, to get them into those beer halls.
So are they consciously drawing from the Bolshevik example?
I mean, when Goebbels talked about the power of film, one of the films that he always cited was Battleship Potemkin.
What's happening now after 1933, 1934?
The Nazis saw the importance of controlling the media, this Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. It was created as a cabinet-level post for Joseph Goebbels, who also was in charge of the Nazi Party's propaganda apparatus.
So in the state, this means newsreels, films, books, radio, libraries. Here we have the big political show of National Socialists. The two attacks on Jews as both being capitalists and communists and Bolsheviks, confused and silly, but apparently effective. So how does one prepare the population for this kind of machinery of destruction?
There is an effort made to both present the Jews as a real physical threat to Germany, and also to identify Jews as being the powers behind the enemy. They would show these Soviet atrocities against the local population, and then identify the Jews as the perpetrators of that. In this particular poster, dealing with the discovery of a Soviet crime in Vinica, to identify the Jewish Bolshevik as the perpetrator of that crime.
Is this the original painting?
Yes.
It is?
Yeah. Now the title comes from the New Testament book of John, but instead of having Jesus as a messianic figure, we have Adolf Hitler. And you can see in the painting the way the light emanates off Adolf Hitler's face over the audience. The audience is portrayed as a kind of a microcosm of German society, but it also emphasizes the importance that Hitler and the Nazis placed on the spoken word. That Adolf Hitler believed that the spoken word, far more than the written word, was responsible for all the great events in history. It allowed you direct contact with your audience. That is, you could play upon their hopes, fears, and frustrations. You could get immediate feedback about what worked and what didn't work. And all that became important as you tailored your message.
How do you see this as relevant to today? I mean, what does this tell us about today's political propaganda, if anything?
An exhibition like this raises questions about how we address propaganda. Is it through...
Okay, right. So that clip, it said loads of really good things to know about Nazi propaganda. It talked about things like how they repeated really simple messages. We know that already from how they used to promise work and bread. We've seen in it how propaganda was absolutely essential in turning the Nazis from a party that wasn't well known, where only 2.6% of the population were voting for them in 1928, to a party that got 37% of the vote in July 1932 and up to 44% of the vote by the time we get to March 1933. So propaganda did help establish the Nazis, but it also helps to reinforce their ideas into society. That video is great because it showed you loads of different propaganda posters from the time. It shows you how they made enemies of the state out of innocent Jewish people, how they showed them in grotesque ways to try and show them as the nation's enemies. And then in contrast to that, we saw how they present women and workers in a positive light because that fits their ideology. So that had loads of great points that hopefully you'll have been able to pick out some of during the time of the video. Let's move on to the next slide. There are lots of different forms of propaganda that we're going to be looking at in today's lesson. And the idea is that you need to have an overview of different forms. You don't need to know just one of them in lots of great depth. Now, if you've got the sheets printed, then you can make your notes in these 4 boxes on that sheet. If you don't have a printed version of the notes, that's not a problem. You're just going to use subheadings instead. So you'll end up with 4 subheadings from the next few slides, 1 on newspapers, 1 on control of the radio, 1 on the Nuremberg rallies, and then 1 on the Berlin Olympics. So let's make a start in going through the information you need to know. The first section you need to know about is newspapers. Now, I've put lots of points on here, but the 3 ones that are in red are the key ones to make some notes on. So newspapers were obviously widely read at this point. People weren't using social media to try and find out the news. Obviously, newspapers were something people read daily. Now, Goebbels knew that these were important, so he moved very quickly in 1933 to ensure that they could establish control over the press. He does it in a very clever way. Rather than them having to read through every article before it's published, instead, he makes newspaper editors accountable for what is printed in their papers. That way, every single editor will have to read the articles and double check them, and they are therefore censoring themselves. When we're thinking about what was accountable in them and what things they were aiming to try and stop them printing, is basically anything negative. So newspaper editors had to make sure that the newspaper stories were positive about the Nazis, that they were very complimentary about their policies. If there was anything that was negative, they could risk being arrested and even put in a concentration camp. So they censored themselves. There was even something called the Reich press chambers that owners of newspapers, editors and journalists had to be members of. And if you weren't racially and politically reliable, you would be sacked. So, for instance, if you were a Jewish journalist, you would have been sacked by the end of 1933. The Nazis even gave them a news agency called the DNB, which issued detailed guidelines on what they could and couldn't print, and would even suggest whole articles that they should publish as well. So essentially, the Nazis controlled all of the newspapers, and as a result, the newspapers became quite bland and repetitive, and newspaper sales declined. So in some ways, this was a great form of propaganda for the Nazis, but in other ways, less successful because membership and readership declined. So I'd like you to pause the video here and make notes on those bits in red. Next area you need to know about is the radio. And remember, you're making notes on the bits in red. Now, the Nazis, including Hitler and Goebbels, thought the radio was one of the most powerful methods of propaganda, one of the best forms of it. That's because they believed that the spoken word was more effective than the written one. And they knew that people like Goebbels and Hitler were very charismatic speakers, and therefore they wanted to make the most of their talents. Now, at this point, when we think about the 1930s, most ordinary people didn't own a radio in the year 1930. They were quite expensive at this point. Remember, there aren't TVs. Radios were seen as a real luxury item. So in order to make sure that people could hear the speeches that Hitler was making over the radio, Nazis subsidised the cost of radios. Basically, they made them cheaper by them putting in some money to make it much cheaper for ordinary people to buy one. This resulted in 70% of German households owning a radio by 1939. That meant that they could hear the speeches of Hitler, and he made over 50 speeches in 1 year on the radio. They didn't only have Nazi speeches because then nobody would want to listen, but they did make sure that they got that balance right between entertainment and reinforcing political messages. Even some stories that they used to sometimes read out loud on the radio would have political messages in them. So for them, it was a great form of propaganda. For the people that still couldn't own a radio because it was still too expensive, or people that wanted to avoid radios because they didn't want to listen to Hitler's speeches, they would then have loudspeakers in the streets, just like in this picture you can see here. So they would have the radio broadcasting at people's workplaces, in public streets, making sure that people couldn't escape those speeches from people like Hitler. So the radio was a really effective form of propaganda for the Nazis, and something that was quite new. They didn't have control of the radio when they were trying to come to power. They only have control now that they're in power, and they control all the radio stations and they control what is published. So pause the video here and make notes on those bits in red. Next area you're going to need to know about is the Nuremberg rallies. Now, before we begin with the notes, I just want to show you a quick video so you get a real sense of what these Nuremberg rallies were like. Okay, so obviously this is part of Nazi propaganda. They have made it look a certain way. They've deliberately created it, and I just want you to get a bit of a sense of what they were like from this video. Okay, I'm just going to pause it there. Now, hopefully you've already got a sense of what the Nuremberg rallies were like. You've seen the fact that they're showing off their military here. You can see from where I've paused it here how many people are in the crowd, and you can see that involves some of Hitler's speeches. So I'm going to move on to the next slide now. We're going to tell you more detail about them. Just like with the other areas, the idea is that you're going to make some notes on the bullet points in red. Now, we've seen what they were like. We've just talked about the fact that they were these enormous rallies that involved tens of thousands of people. The Nazis wanted it to be this way because they wanted to create the impression of a large, well-supported and disciplined organisation. Before they came to power, this helped them win votes because people saw it as in contrast to these weak Weimar politicians that they saw as really disorganised because of all those coalitions that used to fall apart very quickly. They wanted to show before they came to power that they were going to be a group that were going to unite everybody together. And once they were in power from 1933, they wanted to hold these to kind of show how much they were working together as a group, how impressive they were, and to try and convince people that were maybe skeptical about them into being supportive of them. They wanted to try and make the audience feel an emotional response and this idea of belonging and believing. We know that atmosphere is really important. That's why people pay to go and see their favourite musical artist or go and watch a football match, because the atmosphere that you watch it in makes a real difference. And they felt this with their parades. They wanted people to believe they were part of this new and improved Germany. It wasn't just Nuremberg rallies held in the city of Nuremberg. They held parades and rallies all over the country on different national holidays, and people would be expected to put their swastika flags outside their houses on these days. If you didn't, you could get reported on to the Gestapo, and you might even be arrested for not showing enough national pride. So pause the video here and make some notes about what the Nuremberg rallies were like. Next area I'd like you to know about is the Olympics. Now again, you just need the bits in red, but I'm going to talk through it all with you anyway. Now the Olympics of 1936 was held in Berlin. Now this was a vast international propaganda effort. The Nazis spent huge sums of money on this because they built a brand new stadium that could hold 110,000 people. The Nazis tried to make sure that it wasn't just the people of Germany that were impressed with them. They wanted propaganda to be international for other countries to see how far Germany had come under them, to be impressed with the grandeur of Germany. They tried to make sure they stayed impressed by doing things like toning down their anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish propaganda. And they also removed homeless people from the streets and put them in these temporary social camps. Lots of people were impressed with them, not least because they actually came top of the medal table that year and won 33 medals. Hitler tried to use that as an excuse to say that it was the German master race, and he tried to put across his racist ideas even through the Olympics. One person to definitely know about, though, that challenged this idea of the Aryan racial superiority is the amazing athlete, the American athlete Jesse Owens. Now, he was African American. We've got a picture of him there at the top, and he totally destroyed Hitler's idea of there being the Aryan supremacy because he won 4 gold medals for things like the 100 metres, the 200 metres, the long jump, and the 4 times 100 metres relay. So they tried to use the Olympics as propaganda, and they were successful to some extent, although they didn't achieve everything they wanted because of amazing athletes like Jesse Owens. So pause the video here and make notes in those bits in red. Well done for making notes for most of this lesson. Now, you've done the more detailed notes and you've got sections on those 4 different forms of propaganda on the Olympics and the newspapers and radios and the rallies. Now, there is another little section here about the Nazis and cultural changes. If you've printed the resources, you'll have a sheet that looks like this, that's got everything you need to know on it. Now, if you haven't got a printer, don't worry, we can give you a copy of this when you're back. But on the next few slides, we've got little shortened versions of what you really need to know for how they controlled culture. Now, not only was Goebbels in charge of propaganda, he was also in charge of culture as well. So he had the final say on what kind of artwork could be produced in Germany, what kind of music could be sold. He essentially controlled every form of culture and propaganda. So we're going to look at culture at this time, and you're going to write a few notes, but it's going to be less detailed than last time. Last time you were making quite a lot of notes. This time I've really tried to summarise it as basically 1 point for you. Okay, let's have a look at cultural changes then. Now, you might want to do this as a spider diagram where you have the 3 legs of the cinema, literature, and other changes. It's up to you, or you could just do subheadings again. Okay, so the first area we're going to talk about briefly is the cinema. Now remember, during the Weimar Golden Age, when Stresemann was around, between 1924 and 1929, the German film industry exploded, and it was the biggest film industry inside of Europe. They made amazing modern films like The Blue Angel and the film Metropolis. Now the Nazis hated these films, and they wanted to try and make sure their own ideas were pushed through via the films. So they created loads of different films. Goebbels himself read and approved all of the film scripts. The films always carried some kind of pro-Nazi message, for instance, showing German soldiers as heroes and Jews as mean and nasty. A really good example of this is the 1940 film called Sus the Jew. This was all about showing an ambitious Jewish businessman who ends up raping a local German girl and torturing her father and her fiancé. It's basically a piece of anti-Semitic propaganda designed to make Jews look like terrible people, and it was obviously completely wrong. So this is the kind of thing that they would put in place. All of this reinforces their political messages. So don't feel like you've got to write loads of this down. Just the bits in red are all you really need. So pause the video here to do that. Okay, the next section about literature. This is another form of culture that the Nazis tried to control. Now, during the Weimar Golden Age, between 1924 and 1929, there were loads of expressionist books that were created. These were often books that weren't about physical reality, but about a character's mental internal state. The most famous of the Weimar era books was a book called All Quiet on the Western Front. You might have heard of it before because it is a really strong critique of war, and particularly World War I. Now, the Nazis didn't like that kind of book. They wanted war to be glorified because obviously they know that they're going to end up causing one when they invade other nations. So they wanted books that suited their ideals. Goebbels then created a list of banned books which were removed from libraries and bookshops. For instance, anything that was written by a Jewish author was burnt. And you can see an image here of the kind of book burnings that they had, where they would all go and take any banned books and burn them publicly in the streets, often with the Hitler Youth leading these activities. The best-selling book in Germany at this point was Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography that he wrote in prison. It means my struggle. It was even given to you by the state when you got married as a wedding gift, and Hitler made a lot of money from the sales. Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda and Culture, encouraged books about race, the glory of war, and the brilliance of the Nazis. So all of the books that were written during the Weimar Golden Age were basically disliked because they were often critical of war and critical of society, and therefore they were burnt. Lots of writers also left Germany between 1933 and 1945. So did lots of academics. For instance, Albert Einstein left Germany and he fled elsewhere. So pause it and just write those 2 bullet points about literature. So this is the final slide of information and note making, I promise. So on this slide, we can see that it's got information about artwork and music. So you just need something really brief about both of these forms of culture. In terms of art, you might remember artists like George Grosz and Otto Dix. They had created amazing artwork that, again, was often quite critical of war. There's lots of common themes here between the artwork and the literature from the Weimar period. The Nazis disliked it, so just like with the books, they burnt it. So they burnt 5,000 paintings in 1936. They preferred artwork like this picture on the right that shows scenes of healthy and heroic German figures. We saw as well that painting that they created in 1937 where it made Hitler look like Jesus. We saw that already in the video that we watched at the start of the lesson. In terms of music, they wanted to completely change the musical style. In the 1920s, in the Golden Age, it's sometimes called the Jazz Age because it was very much associated with that music. But jazz music is associated with African Americans, and therefore the Nazis really disliked it. They wanted music to be classical and feature the famous German composers, people like Beethoven. So pause the video here and make some notes about those cultural changes. So it'd be great if you could now, on the Q&A section of Teams, tell me about what you think was more effective as a method of control. Do you think it was terror or propaganda? So tell me why you think that. Write me a little answer, and that's going to be the plenary for today's lesson. Please make sure you do that and don't just log off of this without doing it. It's going to be part of the register where I'm checking who's done the work and who's completed it. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you have a lovely evening and well done for doing that work. I look forward to seeing your answers on Teams shortly.